In this video, I'm going to discuss some thorny issues about intuitions and how reliable they might be. And mostly, I'm just going to raise these. You raised a bunch of interesting questions. I'll have some comments, but I don't think I can respond to them all. So the first person says, generally the truths that we find in various sciences cannot be found through sheer intuition. For example, an uneducated person would almost certainly say that a bowling ball would fall faster than a pebble. But this has been shown not to be the case. If there are any underlying truths to philosophical questions, why should we be persuaded by intuition? I think this is a great question. Intuition has shown not to be very valuable in many scientific fields. So why should we trust in philosophy? Somebody else asked a similar question. They say intuition seems to be less suitable for scientific inquiry than for philosophical ones. Why is this so? What makes philosophical inquiries different from the other inquiries for which using intuition is obviously a bad method? And some of you seem to answer your own question or answer each other's question. So here's what another student said. Usage of intuition is plausibly objectionable for metaphysical cases, for we expect there to be one physical reality beyond our perception, and because our native intuitions about the nature of objectively knowable entities have led us astray. Just to say, an example is the bowling ball pebble example. So continuing on that question, the person says, however, we cannot properly object to the use of intuitions in fields like morality and aesthetics, because such fields deal with our values, which are largely intuitive. If we then contend that epistemology is also a normative field, we might allow for intuition in epistemology, but not metaphysics. So that might be partially answering what's different about philosophy, or at least some areas of philosophy, the normative areas. Another person says, epistemology is essentially a human creation. Knowing is a product of our language and thought. Why shouldn't the answer to what is knowledge be whatever we say it is? Is there any point to using pure reasoning to try to answer questions like this? We created the concept of knowledge, so it might make sense that we are the only ones to answer questions regarding it. There's something attractive about these thoughts that sort of, they're normative, and there's something sort of we came up with. They depend on the existence of creatures with minds like us. However, I want to suggest that intuitions are often used in fields of philosophy that aren't normative, and in which we think there is a single answer. So, for instance, we have intuitions. Many people think about logic, and many people think they're important. So here's an example. Many of us, if I ask you, is it possible to both be a philosopher and not be a philosopher? Many of you will say, no, it'll be your intuition. No. And people take this to be evidence for a logical principle called the principle of non-contradiction. Similarly, in metaphysics, we might have intuitions as well that people use in their theorizing. So here's an example of a case. I ask you, is it possible for a cell to be part of my liver and my liver to be part of my body, but the cell to not be part of my body? Most people would say, no, that's impossible. If the cell's part of your liver and the liver's part of your body, then the cell's part of your body. This is evidence for a general principle. It's evidence from a particular example based on our intuitions for a general principle about parts and wholes, a metaphysical principle about how parts relate to wholes. The principle is something like a part of a part is always a part of the whole. And whether that's right or not, metaphysicians debate about it. But we have intuitions, it seems, about these cases, even though logic and metaphysics aren't taken to be normative in this way. They're taken to be cases where there's one objective answer, at least by many. So I think it's interesting to think this idea that normativity is special, or that we made these things up, or that's why they're special. That's attractive. I'm not sure it fully gets around these worries. Finally, somebody said this. They said, the question I have for these authors is, what would epistemology or philosophy more generally look like if we rejected such a reliance on our intuitive judgments? And this is a great question, because many of you sort of said, look, intuitions in science are bad. We tried to see what might make them more reliable or something more usable in philosophy. I think we have some good ideas, normativity, the fact that sort of these are concepts we as humans came up with. But I've given some reasons to maybe think, I don't know if those will totally be will totally work. And so then we have this idea, well, if we don't rely on intuitive judgments, what do we do? Like, how do we do our theorizing? I think this is an extremely hard question for those who want to get rid of intuitions. Maybe we need to rely somewhat on considered judgments about general principles. So not the kind of intuitions about particular cases that we've been talking about, but ones about general principles that we talked about a few videos ago. Or maybe we can think in terms of which concepts best play the role we want them to play. So maybe we take a sort of more pragmatic approach. So for instance, what would knowledge, we could think like this, what would knowledge have to look like in order for it to be the sort of thing we think plays the role we want knowledge to play? So maybe we want it to be reasonable to act in a certain way when we have knowledge, but not act in that way when we don't. Or maybe we want a theory where it's reasonable to assert some proposition when we know it, but not when we don't. What would knowledge have to look like in order for those principles, relating it to how we act in the world, how we assert, how we talk and communicate with other people? What would knowledge have to look like to make principles like that true? Those are kind of much more general questions that might give us some way of thinking, theorizing about knowledge or theorizing in epistemology, even if we aren't relying on particular intuitions. But I do think it's hard. A lot of what gets us to particular theories, what we take as evidence, are intuitions. If we were to leave them behind, there's a lot of thinking to do about what else we can do.